charity, food, and care for the poor, from almsgiving to organized care. 3rd, 5th centuries. Good evening. Tonight we're going to speak quietly about hunger, not in moments of crisis, not in headlines or emergencies, but hunger as a condition of everyday life, about how across long stretches of history, people lived close to the edge of having enough, and how communities slowly learned that food, when shared predictably, could stabilize not just bodies but entire societies. This is a gentle history of charity, of food, and of care for the poor. And before we continue, just one quiet note. If these calm histories help you relax, help you fall asleep, or give you a peaceful place to rest your thoughts at night, you're very welcome to subscribe to the channel. You can also like the video or leave a comment sharing when you usually listen, at bedtime, during the night, or while winding down. It helps this quiet space continue, and now there's nothing more you need to do. Just listen comfortably. For most of human history, hunger was not sudden. It arrived slowly: a poor harvest, a dry season, an illness that prevented work, the loss of a wage earner. Hunger accumulated over weeks, sometimes months, and when it arrived there were few safety nets. In the ancient Roman world, food distribution did exist, but it was selective. The annona, Rome's public grain dole, was reserved primarily for male citizens of the city. It did not extend to women, it did not extend to foreigners, it did not extend to the rural poor. If you lived outside Rome, or if you lost legal status, you were on your own. Charity existed, but it was personal, sporadic, and often tied to patronage. A wealthy household might distribute food on a festival day. A benefactor might fund a public meal to gain honor or political favor, but these acts were not designed to sustain life long term. They were moments, not systems. This is the world into which early Christian communities emerged, not with the idea that poverty would disappear, but with a different assumption, that hunger, when visible, created responsibility. By the late 3rd century, Christian communities in cities such as Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and Carthage were already organizing care for the poor in ways that differed markedly from surrounding society. One of the most significant shifts was administrative. Charity became managed. Bishops were not only spiritual leaders, they became stewards of resources. By the early 4th century, church records show that bishops oversaw food stores, financial accounts, and distribution schedules. This was not accidental. The early church inherited Roman administrative habits, record-keeping, lists, oversight, and applied them to care. One of the clearest early examples comes from Caesarea in Cappadocia in modern-day Turkey. Around the year 370, Basil of Caesarea, later known as Basil the Great, organized what historians recognize as one of the earliest comprehensive systems of poor relief. Basil did not treat charity as optional generosity. He treated it as obligation. He preached openly against hoarding grain during famine, arguing that excess food belonged to the hungry by right. Under his leadership, Caesarea developed structured food distribution, care for the sick, and housing for the poor. This complex, sometimes called the Basiliad, included facilities for feeding the hungry on an ongoing basis, not during crisis alone. Regular meals, predictable care. This matters because predictability changes how people survive. When food is predictable, families can endure illness. Children can survive winters. Widows do not have to beg daily. Around the same period, the Church in Rome formalized support for widows. By the mid-4th century, lists were maintained of women who received regular distributions of food and oil. These widows were not anonymous recipients. They were known, counted, remembered. Support was ongoing. This was revolutionary. In Roman society, widows often lost economic security immediately upon a husband's death. Without male guardianship, many fell rapidly into poverty. By recognizing widows as a defined group deserving sustained care, Christian communities created one of the earliest long-term welfare categories. This was not emergency relief, it was enrollment. Similarly, orphans began to receive structured support. Children without family were fed, sheltered, and sometimes raised within Christian households or institutions. Again, not randomly but deliberately. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, cities such as Antioch and Constantinople maintained daily food distributions for the poor under church oversight. John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople around the year 400, spoke frequently about organized charity. He criticized displays of wealth in a city where hunger persisted and urged regular, systematic giving rather than emotional gestures. This language matters. It signals a shift from charity as feeling to charity as structure. Almsgiving, once spontaneous, became habitual. Christians were encouraged to give small amounts regularly, weekly, monthly. This stabilized resources. And stabilization prevents collapse. As the Western Roman Empire declined in the 5th century, civic food systems weakened. Grain shipments failed, administrative offices dissolved, but in many cities, church-based food distribution remained. This continuity is one of the reasons urban life did not disappear entirely. Even when imperial authority vanished, the habit of feeding the poor persisted. As Europe entered the early medieval period, these systems adapted rather than vanished. Monasteries inherited responsibility. Monastic rules, especially the rule of St. Benedict, written around the year 530, placed feeding the poor alongside prayer and labor. Hospitality was not symbolic, it was logistical. Monasteries cultivated land, stored grain, and planned meals with the expectation that outsiders would arrive hungry. Guest houses were standard features. The poor were not turned away. This required discipline. Monks lived simply so that resources could stretch further. This was not theatrical poverty, it was economic planning. During years of famine, monasteries often became the most reliable sources of food in entire regions. Peasants knew where to go. They knew that help, however modest, existed. By the 7th and 8th centuries, this model had spread widely. Ireland, Gaul, Italy, and parts of Spain all show evidence of monastic food distribution systems. Again, these systems did not eliminate hunger, but they softened it. They reduced panic. They created breathing room. What is most important to notice is not the scale of aid, but its consistency. Care, repeated over time, becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure shapes society. By embedding food distribution into daily and weekly routines, early Christian communities redefined what it meant to belong to a society. Membership implied obligation, not just belief, but responsibility. This idea of us that hunger is a shared problem would echo across centuries. It would shape medieval parishes, guilds, and eventually state welfare systems. But it began here, quietly, in kitchens, storehouses, and shared meals. As you rest now, there is no need to remember names or dates, just notice the rhythm. Hunger addressed before desperation. Food shared before collapse. Care becoming predictable. Take a slow breath in and let it go. We will continue. Episode 3. Segment 2. Charity, food, and care for the poor monasteries. Daily feeding and the discipline of sustained care, 6th, 10th centuries. As the Roman world faded in the West, care did not disappear. It moved. It shifted away from cities and imperial offices and settled into places built for endurance. Monasteries. By the 6th century, monasteries had become some of the most stable institutions in a rapidly changing landscape. Kings came and went, borders shifted, trade routes weakened, but monasteries remained. They remained because they were designed not for speed or growth, but for repetition, daily prayer, daily labor, daily meals. And within this repetition, care for the poor found a durable home. One of the most influential documents in the history of organized charity was written around the year 530, the Rule of St. Benedict. Benedict of Nursia, living in Italy during a time of political fragmentation, did not set out to design a welfare system, but his rule did exactly that. The rule governed how monks lived together, how they worked, how they ate, how they rested, and crucially, how they treated outsiders. Hospitality, Benedict wrote, was to be treated as sacred. Every guest was to be received as Christ himself. This was not metaphorical. It had practical consequences. Monasteries were expected to feed strangers, to house travelers, to care for the poor, not occasionally, consistently. The rules specified meals, portions, schedules. Food was not improvised, it was planned. 2 meals a day under normal circumstances, adjustments during fasting seasons, extra portions for the sick and the elderly. This level of detail mattered because detail makes systems repeatable. Across Italy, Gaul, and later across much of Western Europe, monasteries adopted this rule. With it came a new approach to food. Monastic communities cultivated land deliberately. Fields were rotated, gardens maintained, vegetables, legumes, grain. Food production was tied directly to food distribution. This created resilience. During years of plenty, surplus was stored. During lean years, stores were opened. Monasteries became de facto granaries for surrounding communities. In regions where civic authority was weak, this stability was critical. Peasants knew where food might be found, not abundance, but enough to survive. By the 7th century, monasteries in Ireland had become particularly influential. Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire, and yet it developed a dense network of monastic communities. These monasteries combined education, hospitality, and charity. Irish monastic rules emphasized the feeding of the poor as a daily obligation, not as charity days, but as routine. Monks worked fields not only for themselves, but for distribution. When Irish monks traveled to continental Europe, to Gaul, to northern Italy, to what is now Switzerland, they carried these habits with them. Figures such as Columbanus, who died in 615, founded monasteries that became centers of learning and care. At Luxeuil, at Bobbio, food distribution was integrated into monastic life. These monasteries did not wait for famine, they planned for it. By the 8th and 9th centuries, under the Carolingian rulers, monastic charity became increasingly systematized. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in the year 800, issued capitularies encouraging monasteries to maintain hospitality and poor relief. This was not purely religious, it was political. Stable food systems reduced unrest. A population that was fed was less likely to revolt. Again, care and governance intertwined quietly. Monasteries were expected to maintain guest houses. These were separate buildings, often near the monastery entrance. Travelers were fed, the poor were housed temporarily, the sick were cared for. Importantly, monastic hospitality did not distinguish sharply between local poor and strangers. Need was the primary criterion. This universality mattered. It prevented exclusion. It reinforced the idea that hunger itself created obligation. During this period, Europe experienced recurring cycles of famine, poor weather, crop disease, limited storage technology. Food scarcity was common. What changed was response. Instead of total collapse, there was mitigation. Monasteries distributed stored grain. They extended meals. They reduced their own consumption. This discipline required restraint. Monks lived on limited diets even in good years. This allowed reserves to exist when bad years arrived. This was not accidental charity, it was foresight. By the 9th century, records show monasteries functioning as economic stabilizers. They loaned grain, they distributed bread, they fed those who could not work. This did not eliminate hunger, but it reduced mortality. And reducing mortality changes history. Another important development during this period was the rise of hospital monasteries. These were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were places where food, shelter, and basic care were provided together. Often attached to monasteries, they served pilgrims, the sick, and the poor. Food was central: broths, bread, simple, digestible meals. The act of feeding was considered part of healing. This understanding that nourishment is care seems obvious now. It was not then. By integrating food distribution into institutions of care, monastic communities reinforced the idea that hunger and illness were linked. This connection would shape later medical practice. As Europe moved into the 10th century, these systems had become familiar, expected. People knew that monasteries fed the poor. They planned their movements accordingly. This expectation is key. Expectation creates trust. Trust allows people to survive uncertainty. As you listen now, you may feel the rhythm slow. That is appropriate. This history is not about moments. It is about repetition. Meals prepared daily, grain stored seasonally, care offered routinely. These small acts, repeated across centuries, reshaped how societies responded to hunger. Food became shared responsibility, not universal, not perfect, but durable. Take a slow breath and let it go. We will continue. Episode 3, Segment 3, Charity, Food and Care for the Poor Parishes, Guilds and the Local Architecture of Care, 11th, 14th centuries. As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages, roughly between the 11th and 14th centuries, the structure of society began to change again. Towns grew, trade expanded, populations became denser. With this growth came new forms of vulnerability. Hunger was no longer only rural, it became urban. Cities attracted workers, craftsmen, widows, and migrants. But cities also magnified risk. If work disappeared, there was no land to fall back on. Food had to be purchased. Rent had to be paid. In this new environment, the older monastic model of care, centralized, rural, and land-based, was no longer sufficient on its own. Care moved closer to daily life, into neighborhoods, into parishes, into guild halls. By the 11th century, the parish had become the primary unit of social organization in much of Europe. A parish was small, local. People were baptized there, married there, buried there. And increasingly, they were supported there. Parish priests were not only spiritual figures, they were administrators of aid. Church records from England, France, and Italy show parishes collecting food and money specifically for poor relief. Offerings were not consumed immediately. They were stored, measured, distributed. Bread doles became common. In many towns, bread was baked regularly and distributed to the poor at fixed times, not during famine alone, weekly, sometimes daily. This predictability mattered deeply because hunger is less destructive when it is anticipated. By the 12th century, many parishes maintained lists of those eligible for regular aid. Widows, the elderly, the disabled, these lists were updated. Support was reviewed. This was administration, not impulse. At the same time, guilds emerged as powerful institutions. Guilds were associations of workers, bakers, weavers, masons, carpenters. They regulated trade, maintained standards, protected members, but they also provided social support. Guild statutes from the 12th and 13th centuries frequently include provisions for aid. If a member fell ill, food was supplied. If a craftsman died, his widow and children received support. This support was funded by regular contributions from members. Again, predictability mattered. Guild aid reduced dependence on begging, it preserved dignity. And dignity reduces social fragmentation. Guilds often worked alongside parishes. A widow might receive bread from the parish and additional aid from her husband's guild. This layering of care created resilience. No single institution bore the entire burden. Responsibility was shared. Urban centres provide some of the clearest examples. In London, by the late 12th century, parish-based poor relief was well established. Church wardens managed funds, bread doles were distributed. Hospitals, such as St. Bartholomew S., founded in 1123, provided food and shelter to the sick and poor. Importantly, these hospitals were not isolated institutions. They were embedded in urban networks of care. Food was sourced locally, distributed locally. In Paris, the Hôtel Dieu expanded significantly during this period. Located near Notre Dame, it served as a central point for feeding and caring for the poor. Records from the 13th century describe daily meals provided to patients and to the destitute. Again, not emergency relief, routine. Florence offers another instructive case. By the 13th century, Florence had developed a complex network of charitable institutions. Confraternities, lay religious associations, played a major role. These groups organized food distribution dowry funds for poor women, and burial services. Food was central. Confraternities collected donations, purchased grain, and organized meals. Some confraternities specialized in feeding specific groups, orphans, the sick, or travelers. This specialization increased efficiency. Aid was not scattered, it was targeted. Another important development was the emergence of community granaries. In regions prone to famine, grain was stored collectively. During good years, grain was purchased or contributed. During bad years, it was released at controlled prices or distributed to the poor. These granaries were often managed by parishes or town councils in cooperation with church authorities. The goal was stabilization, preventing price spikes, preventing hoarding. This approach reflects a mature understanding of food security. It recognized that hunger is not only about scarcity, but about access. By moderating access, communities reduced panic. Throughout this period, care remained local. This is crucial. Large centralized systems were fragile. Local systems adapted. If one parish struggled, another might assist. If a guild faced hardship, members contributed more. This flexibility allowed care to survive political upheaval. Wars came and went. Kings changed, but parishes remained. Guilds persisted. The church's role during this period was not to control every aspect of charity. It was to normalize it, to embed the expectation that feeding the hungry was part of ordinary life, not heroic, not exceptional, ordinary. This normalization mattered enormously because once care becomes ordinary, it does not require constant justification. It continues even when enthusiasm fades. As Europe approached the 14th century, this system would face severe strain. Population growth increased demand. Climate fluctuations reduced supply. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 tested these structures. Many failed, but many endured. Parishes increased distributions. Granaries were opened. Guilds extended aid. Mortality was still high, but total collapse was avoided in many regions. This resilience was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of layered, local care. As you rest now, notice the quiet strength of this system. Not dramatic intervention, just food appearing regularly, bread, soup, grain, shared responsibility turning hunger from catastrophe into something survivable. Take a slow breath in and let it go. We will continue. Episode 3. Segment 4. Charity, food, and care for the poor widows, orphans, hospitals, and care that endured crisis, 4th, 15th centuries. As systems of food distribution became more established, another reality demanded attention. Not everyone could recover once hunger arrived. Some lives were marked by permanent vulnerability. Widows, orphans, the chronically ill, the elderly, these were not temporary conditions. They did not resolve with a good harvest or a return to work. They required sustained care. In the ancient world, these groups often fell through every gap. Widows, in particular, were among the most precarious. In Roman law, a woman's economic security was typically tied to male guardianship. When a husband died, property could be contested, income could vanish, social protection was minimal. Early Christian communities responded by naming widows explicitly. This naming matters because once a group is named, it can be planned for. By the 4th century, church records in cities such as Rome, Antioch, and Constantinople show widows listed as recipients of regular support. This support was not symbolic. It included food distributions, oil for cooking and lamps, and sometimes clothing. Widows were not expected to seek aid repeatedly. They were enrolled. This reduced humiliation and created continuity. The same approach was gradually extended to orphans. In the ancient world, orphanhood often meant death. Without family, children had little chance of survival. Christian communities began to absorb this responsibility. At first, orphans were raised within households. Later, more formal arrangements emerged. By the 5th and 6th centuries, institutions began to appear that we would now recognize as early orphanages. These were often attached to churches or monasteries. They provided food, shelter, and basic instruction. Not education as advancement, but education as survival. Reading simple prayers, learning a trade. Food remained central. Without nutrition, nothing else mattered. As Europe entered the medieval period, care for widows and orphans became increasingly institutionalized. Hospitals played a key role. But medieval hospitals were not primarily medical. They were places of shelter, food, warmth, care. The word hospital comes from hospes, guest. These institutions existed to receive those who had nowhere else to go. One of the most enduring examples is the Hôtel Dieu in Paris. Founded in the 7th century, it expanded significantly between the 12th and 14th centuries. The Hôtel Dieu served the sick, the poor, the orphaned, and the elderly. Records describe large communal wards where patients were fed daily. Broth, bread, simple meals. Care was basic by modern standards, but nourishment was consistent. Consistency mattered. Across Europe, similar institutions emerged. In London, St. Bartholomew's Hospital and St. Thomas's Hospital provided food and shelter as much as medical care. In Italy, cities such as Florence, Siena, and Milan developed hospital networks supported by church and civic authorities. Food provision was a defining feature. Hospitals maintained kitchens, bakeries, and storehouses. They planned meals carefully to stretch resources. The poor were not fed extravagantly, they were fed reliably. Another important development during this period was the rise of foundling hospitals. These institutions cared specifically for abandoned infants. Infant abandonment was tragically common in medieval cities. Poverty, social stigma, illegitimacy. Parents sometimes believed abandonment offered a chance of survival that staying did not. Foundling hospitals emerged to meet this need. One of the most famous examples is the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, founded in 1419. Designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, it combined architecture, care, and administration. Infants were received anonymously, they were fed. Wet nurses were employed, children were raised, with the intention of eventual apprenticeship or service. Again, food was foundational: milk, bread, broth. Without nourishment, no care was possible. These institutions were expensive, they required sustained funding. Church networks, donations, and civic contributions all played a role. The key point is continuity. These were not emergency shelters. They operated year after year. Crisis tested these systems repeatedly. The most severe test came with plague. Beginning in 1347, the Black Death swept through Europe. Mortality was immense. In some regions, up to half the population died. Fear was pervasive. Many fled cities, markets collapsed, food systems were disrupted, and yet charitable institutions did not disappear. They struggled, they adapted, hospitals expanded admissions, parishes increased distributions. Care continued even as caregivers themselves fell ill. Chronicles from the period describe clergy and hospital workers remaining in place, feeding the sick, burying the dead, often at the cost of their own lives. This endurance mattered, because crisis reveals what systems are truly built to do. Emergency generosity often collapses under pressure. Structured care endures longer. During plague years, food distribution became even more critical. Weakness from hunger made disease more deadly. Providing nourishment was one of the few interventions available. Hospitals adjusted diets, broths replaced solid foods, portions were modified. This adaptability reflects practical intelligence. Care was not static, it responded. As plague waves recurred over the next 3 centuries, these systems became normalized. Cities expected hospitals to exist. Parishes expected poor relief to continue. The presence of care became part of urban identity. By the 15th century, care for widows, orphans, and the poor was no longer extraordinary. It was assumed. This assumption is crucial, because once care is assumed, It no longer depends on individual virtue alone. It becomes infrastructure. As you rest now, notice how this care feels. Not dramatic rescue, not heroic intervention. Just food arriving day after day. Bread, soup, milk for infants. Care continuing even when the world feels unstable. Take a slow breath in and let it go. We will move toward the close. Episode 3, Segment 5, Charity Food and Care for the Poor from Church, Charity to Civic Welfare. A Quiet Inheritance, 15th, 17th centuries. As Europe moved out of the late medieval period and into what we now call the early modern world, the landscape of power began to change. Cities grew stronger, states centralized authority, bureaucracies expanded, and with these changes, care for the poor began to shift once more, not away from charity, but outward, from monasteries and parishes into civic institutions. This shift did not happen suddenly. It was not a replacement. It was an inheritance. By the 15th century, organized charity had become expected. Not questioned, not debated, expected. Cities assumed that food distribution would exist, that hospitals would operate, that widows and orphans would be supported. This expectation did not come from theory. It came from centuries of practice. Municipal authorities did not invent care systems, they absorbed them. In cities across Italy, France, England, and the Low Countries, civic governments began to regulate what had long existed. Hospitals that were once fully church-run became jointly administered. Parish relief was standardized. Guild support was incorporated into civic law. This transition is especially visible in England. By the 16th century, England faced profound change. Monasteries were dissolved under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541. This removed one of the most important providers of food and poor relief. The disappearance of monasteries created immediate crisis. Hunger increased, begging rose, disorder followed. This reaction is telling. It reveals how dependent society had become on structured charity. The response was not to abandon care, it was to rebuild it. Between 1597 and 1601, England enacted what became known as the Elizabethan Poor Laws. These laws formalized responsibility for caring for the poor at the parish level, food relief, work assistance, support for widows and the disabled. The poor laws did not emerge from nothing. They were modeled on existing parish systems that had long been overseen by church authorities. The state inherited the framework. It added enforcement. But the logic was familiar. Local responsibility, regular support, categorization of need. The same principles that had governed early church charity now governed law. Similar transitions occurred elsewhere. In France, municipal hospitals absorbed charitable functions. In Italy, civic confraternities were regulated by city governments. In the Low Countries, town councils oversaw poor relief in partnership with religious groups. This pattern repeats. Care moves outward, but it does not disappear. The language may change, the administrators may change, but the system remains recognizable. Food distribution continues, support for widows and orphans continues. Hospitals continue to provide shelter and nourishment as much as treatment. Even as medical science advanced, food remained central. Nutrition was recognized as a foundation of health. This understanding was not theoretical, it was learned. Through centuries of feeding the hungry, through kitchens that never closed, through bread baked day after day. As the 17th century progressed, care became more regulated. Poor relief became conditional in some places. Workhouses emerged. Not all developments were gentle, but the underlying assumption endured. That hunger left unaddressed destabilizes society. That care, when predictable, creates order. This insight, quietly learned over centuries, shaped the modern world. Today, when we assume that food aid exists, that shelters operate, that hospitals feed patients, we are drawing on this inheritance. Even when religious language is absent, the structure remains. Lists of recipients, regular distributions, long-term planning, care as infrastructure, not spectacle. As you rest now, you are lying within this long continuity, a world shaped not only by power and conquest, but by kitchens, granaries, and shared meals, by people who planned ahead so others could survive tomorrow. This is not a loud history. It does not announce itself. It simply continues. And before we close tonight, just one final, gentle note. If you find these calm histories helpful, if they help you relax, slow your thoughts, or fall asleep more easily, you're very welcome to subscribe to the channel. You can also like the video or leave a comment sharing what you enjoyed most or when you usually listen. Your presence here helps this quiet space continue. And now there is nothing left to do. The story can rest, and so can you. Sleep well.